Hosea chapter 2, our text this afternoon is verses 9 through 20. Last week we started this chapter. Samuel had verses 1 through 8, dealing with the pleading of God, the pleading of Hosea to his people, to his children, that Israel would return to God and that Gomer would return home to her husband. And he says that he's going to take away these provisions in verse 8 because she did not know that he was the one that gave them to her, and she was attributing them to her lovers, and we'll see that more in our text. But Hosea chapter 2, verses 9 through 20. Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and will recover my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of mine hand. I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts. And I will destroy her vines and her fig trees, whereof she hath said, These are my rewards that my lovers have given me. And I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. And I will visit upon her the days of Balaam, wherein she burned incense to them, and she decked herself with her earrings and her jewels, and she went after her lovers, and forgat me, saith the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her, and bring her into the wilderness, and speak comfortably unto her. And I will give her her vineyards from thence, in the valley of Achor for a door of hope. And she shall sing there as in the days of her youth, and as in the days when she came up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi, and shalt call me no more Bali. For I will take away the names of Balaam out of her mouth, and they shall no more be remembered by their name. And in that day will I make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, and with the fowls of heaven, and with the creeping things of the ground. And I will break the bow and the sword, and the battle out of the earth, and will make them to lie down safely. And I will betroth thee unto me forever. Yea, I will betroth thee unto me in righteousness, and in judgment, and in loving kindness, and in mercy. I will even betroth thee unto me in faithfulness, and thou shalt know the Lord. I've given the message the title from verse number 15. The title is The Valley of Achor for a Door of Hope. The Valley of Achor for a Door of Hope. Lord, I thank you for this day, and I pray that you'd bless this time that we have in your word. I pray that you'd give us strength and wisdom, and I pray that you would speak to our hearts and draw us close to you, and that you would do a work, and that you'd be help, and that your people would be moved closer toward you through it. And we thank you for the things that we'll see in this passage. It's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. So when we think about the title, The Valley of Achor for a Door of Hope, we'll get into more of the history of that. But the Valley of Achor was an actual real place for historical Israel. It had historical meaning for them. And the Hebrew word for Achor means trouble. And so right off the bat there, he'll give them the valley of trouble for a door of hope. And that doesn't make sense to us, but that's kind of the theme of this whole passage. From verse 9 to verse 20 is that the valley of trouble, this narrow strait that's troublesome, would be their door to hope. And when we think about Hosea speaking of Gomer here and God speaking of Israel here, it's hard for us to wrap our mind about how that could be the case. But I trust we'll see that as we go on. The first point is a supreme husband, which in my notes I have capitalized because it's not just Hosea, but speaking of God toward Israel. So you can write the supreme husband or the supreme God. And that is Hosea 2, verses 9 through 13. And he starts the text with the word therefore. And when you see therefore, you got to go see what it's there for. And in the passage last week, he was talking about how Israel didn't realize who was giving her these gifts. It says in verse 8, "For she did not know that I gave her her corn and wine and oil and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal." And so he was speaking to Israel, and he said, "I've given you all these things in this land." And you go back to the books of the law when God is bringing Israel into the promised land. And we see the promises of how it was a land that flowed with milk and honey. It was a land that was abundant with food. It was a land that would satisfy their every need. And when you go to the mountain of cursing and the mountain of blessing, and those blessings and cursings were read in the blessing, if they would follow God and they would hearken to His voice and be obedient to Him, in those blessings was that there would be rain from heaven, that there would be a plentiful harvest, that their needs would be supplied, they would be provided for by God. And these things that were given to them by God in mercy and in faithfulness to His covenant, they were using to furnish their unfaithfulness to God, because they were preparing those things for Baal, when really what should have happened, and we'll see this in the passage we'll read in a minute, but they should have received what God had given Him praise for it, and used it to further His work and to be more obedient to Him. But he says, "Therefore, because she didn't know, because Israel didn't know that I was the one giving these things to her, and she was attributing them to her lovers," God says, "Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and will recover my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. And now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand." And so this corn, this provision, these things that Hosea would have been providing for his family, would have been providing for his wife, even though she was unfaithful, the provision God was giving to Israel, there's going to come a time He's going to take those things away. Because the goal was, and we saw this last week and we'll see it again this week, the goal is that she would say, now it was better for me with my first husband. And I'm going to return to Hosea, and for Israel to say, I'm going to return to God. And in Hosea 6, it talks about Israel rising up and saying, "Come, let us return unto the Lord." And so that's the goal of this. And so God says that in the time thereof, or when the corn's ripe off the stalk, when it's in season, when the wine is in season, when it should be the best. I mean, all summer, all year round is a good time to eat strawberries. But there's that month or 2 months where they're the best of the best. And our one neighbor used to bring us corn. He would go to a big corn farm over here in Ohio somewhere, and he knew the people real well, and they would let him stand there and actually pick the corn off the conveyor belt as it came from the field, from the trucks. And he knew what he was doing with corn, and he always picked the best, and he would always bring it to us. And it was the best. But there's that season, and God is saying that, and when it's prime time, when it's at peak, that the best is what He's going to take away from them, because the best that they had was not what they were giving to God. Think about Hosea and Gomer. What she had that should have been all for him, she was giving to everyone else, and every once in a while the leftovers to him, and that's not how it should have been in that marriage relationship. It all should have been for him, and they each for one another. But that's not how it was. And so in the peak, God says He's going to take it from them. Then it talks about how He's going to take the flax that He had given to cover her nakedness, and now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of my hand. We get this first point about the supreme husband in this part of verse number 10, where it says, "None shall deliver her out of my hand." And Gomer, we saw this in the passage last week. She's saying how she's going to go after her lovers, because she said, they're the ones giving me all this provision. They're the ones giving me all these good things. And I'm going to go after them, and I'm going to follow after them. And they're the ones that are going to satisfy me. They're the ones that are going to give me what I want. But here, this supreme husband, he says, none shall deliver her out of my hand. So it's important to remember when we look at God, when we look at Him as our Father, but also as we, the church, being the bride of Christ. When we look at Him and these judgments that He pronounces, we know we're not going to deliver ourselves from the judgment of God. We know Satan can't do it. He's going to be damned to eternal fire, just like every lost person. And we look to the things of the world, we look to the pleasures, we look to the things that we love. But it's important to understand nothing will deliver us from the hand of judgment of God. The only thing that can deliver us from the hand of judgment of the Lord is the Lord himself. He's the only one that would make a way of escape for us. He's the only one that could deliver us from the just punishment that we've incurred and that we've brought upon ourselves. He's the only one, but none shall deliver her out of my hand. Not even her lovers, not the whole army of lovers that she would have had, would be able to deliver her from a jealous husband. And that jealousy, but that jealous love would come out, and it would be justice for her sin that these things would be taken away. But it's also important to always remember in Hosea, it's with the point of restoration. It's for the point of her coming back home where she belonged. And it says that he would discover that what he had given to cover her nakedness would be taken away, and he would discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers. Obviously, the type of business she was in, we understand that her nakedness was often discovered. We understand. And so when we look at this, the idea here, and what the writer's trying to get across, is this wouldn't be a pleasurable type of discovering. This type of discovering is one that would be shameful, it would be hurtful, it would be embarrassing, it would be not the kind she was looking for. It's not the kind that she had experienced. It would change, and that was the work that God would do to Israel. That was the work that Hosea would do toward Gomer through this. And so this isn't, and kind of the irony of it, that's what she was seeking. That's what her whole life was about. But the irony of it is that it was going to go farther than what she wanted and what she anticipated. And it would be the same thing, but it would not have the effect. It would not have the desire. It would not have the fulfillment to her desire. It would be a different type of discovering that was not what was wanted. And I think we all experience things like that in our lives. We go for something, and we seek something. We have our habits. We have our sinfulness, and it will always come around. And more often than not, we'll get what we want, but then we'll realize it's not at all what we wanted, and it's more severe and not desirable. But in verse 11 he says, I will also cause all her mirth to cease, that is her joy. He would cause her joy to cease, her feast days and her new moons and her Sabbaths and all her solemn feasts. When we think about her mirth to cease, when God would make the joy of Israel, these things going away, the prosperity that God blessed them with being taken from them, their joy would cease in that. And then also her feast days. These were the days, this would have been celebration. These would have been times when the nation would come together to celebrate, whether it was the Passover coming out of Israel, the Feast of Tabernacles, where they would have remembered how their ancestors had dwelt in the wilderness, but God's going to make those to cease. Her new moons, kind of the turning of a new chapter, the beginning of that, and her Sabbaths, the day that would have been for rest. God's going to take those things away. And it's interesting that they would have done, all these things are outward. Their mirth or their joy, their feast days, their new moons, their Sabbaths, her solemn feasts, all these are outward things. And they could do these outward things still having a wicked heart. And we see that in Isaiah chapter 1, where Isaiah writes to the people, and he writes them, and God speaking through Isaiah says to stop with your feasts, to stop with your sacrifices. They don't profit me anything. And he says, come, let us reason together. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as wool. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be white as snow. And the issue was the heart. And I found it interesting as I studied this that it was the external covering of her nakedness that would be taken away. And the next verse dives into the spiritual. What was covering her spiritual nakedness, what was covering her spiritual state of being undone and empty, that was going to be taken away too. And it went from physical, it went to spiritual. And those things, the things that she could do to make everyone else think everything was good and everything was fine, those things were going to be taken away from her as a nation and as a bride. And that rest would be gone, because in verse 7 of the chapter it says, and she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them. She shall seek them, but shall not find them. And so this continual chasing and chasing and chasing to never come up with them and never find them. And in verse 11 it says that her Sabbaths would cease, and that would be the day of rest that Israel would have had. The Lord's day, the day of rest, to rest from their labor. She would never have that, because the things she was seeking, she could never find. The Bible says that if we would seek the Lord with our whole heart, we would find Him. And she could have had a pretty simple. She could have had her rest. She could have had her joy if she would have received what God was giving her, and if she would have been satisfied and faithful to that. But instead, she was chasing all these other things. In verse 12 it says, and I will destroy her vines and her fig trees, whereof she hath said, these are my rewards that my lovers have given me. A vine and fig tree to Israel, these are pictures of peace and prosperity. And so this vine and this fig tree would have been that in, I have it written down somewhere, in 1 Kings 4, verse 23 and 25, it talks about how with the kings, and I believe it was Solomon, but when Solomon won all these battles, it says that every man went and dwelt under his vine and under his fig tree. And so we remember David more as a warrior, a man who was constantly fighting battles and fighting wars. And then King Solomon comes up, and the wars seem to die down, and these people cease from battle, and they go and they sit under their fig tree. And also in Micah 4:4, that's a futuristic prophecy that God gives about when the restoration happens and when He reigns as king. It says that every man will sit under his vine and under his fig tree. And so this vine and this fig tree that God says He's going to destroy, this was an important thing to Israel. This was their prosperity. This was a sign of their peace that they had. And He says, I'm going to destroy them because they say, these are my rewards that my lovers have given me. If you want to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 7 through 10, it says, for the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which He hath given thee. And so here in Deuteronomy, that vine and that fig tree, who gave those things to Israel? It was God that gave them. God brought them into the land where the fig tree and the vine was. And then here in Hosea, Israel is saying, my lovers, who would have been the other nations that they were going to, the other gods they were serving, Baal, Ashtaroth, all the other gods, they're saying they're the ones that are giving us the vine and the fig tree. They're the ones that are giving us peace. They're the ones that are giving us prosperity. And what does God say? He's going to come in return, and He's going to take away the things that He gave, and He's going to leave you naked and open before the gods that you were serving, because He wants you to realize that He's the one giving it, and He's the one providing for you. And so this vine and fig tree, they were given by God. And think the offense of God. And I think even we as imperfect humans, look at these men that Gomer would have been keeping company with that would stoop low enough to steal another man's wife. They're perfectly fine with 50 other guys doing the same thing with her that they're doing with her. To steal another man's wife, and most of them probably had their own wives at home, and all this, and then they're saying, they're bringing God down to that level. They're looking at these men, and even that would bother us some, that, we wouldn't want to be identified with that crowd. But God in heaven, a holy God, a righteous God, who is holy and set apart, and they're looking at these good gifts from Him, the peace that only He can give, prosperity that He's giving, and they're looking at Him, they're looking at the gifts that He gave through sinful, through wicked eyes, and it's very offensive to God because He's the one giving these things. He was the one, as we saw in Deuteronomy, that gave the vine and the fig tree, and they're giving it the praise and the adoration to their lovers and to these false gods. And he says in verse 12, "And I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them." It's important to keep the beasts of the field in mind there, because we'll see that again in verse 18. In verse 13, "And I will visit upon her the days of Balaam, wherein she burned incense unto them, and she decked herself with her earrings and her jewels, and she went after her lovers and forgot me, saith the Lord." If you go back to Judges chapter 2, verses 10 through 14, you'll read about how Joshua and all that generation died, and the generation arose up that knew not the Lord, nor the works that He had done. And in that very passage, it went from Joshua and that generation dying, this generation rising up, that knew not the Lord nor His works. And it says that in verse 14, it says that they went and they served Balaam and they served Ashtaroth. And it was a really quick shift from serving God to serving those, but it was because they didn't know the Lord and they didn't know the works that He had done. And so those are the days of Balaam that it's talking about, the time of the children of Israel serving Baal, which really happened much throughout history. And he says that they forgot me, saith the Lord. Psalm 9:27 says, "The nation that forgets God will be turned into hell." And so we think about Israel, we think about the United States of America right now, where we're at. The nation that forgets God will be turned into hell. And it's easy for us when we begin reading this passage that God's going to take away, and God's going to discover her nakedness, God's going to take away her food and her provision. It's easy for us, I think, to look through wrong-colored lenses and want to draw back from God because of that. That's not merciful. But when we realize that they forgot God and the nation that forgets God would be turned into hell, and He's not turning her into hell, He's actually giving her a chance to come back to Himself. This is a very merciful thing that He does. But the nation that forgets God will be turned into hell, and no one will deliver them out of God's hand. You can try anything you want to. You can try any method. You can try any 10-step program. You can try anything you want. You can trust anything you want. But no one will deliver you from the punishment that your sin has brought. No one can deliver us from the hand of God in that. And the nation that forgets God will be turned into hell, because the Bible says the wages of sin is death. And it says that we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. And he says, "They forgot me, saith the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness." What happened to Israel in the wilderness? Israel in the wilderness, they were being taken from Egypt over to the promised land. They went through the wilderness. There was disobedience. There was punishment. The whole generation that came out of Egypt died in the wilderness because of their sin. And so here God says, they've forgotten me, and we know that the nation that forgets God will be turned into hell. But He says, I'm going to bring her and I'm going to lure her into the wilderness. This is a scary thing, unless it was for the steadfast love of the husband, and that's the second point. He says, I will allure her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. Comfortably there just means from the heart. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, He says that He was meek and lowly of heart. And in Lamentations 3:33, He says that He does not afflict the children of men willingly. And that word willingly comes from a very similar word to comfortably. It's the same root, and it just means from the heart. So when we think about God seeing this rebellious people that He loved so much, and He brings them into the wilderness, not for destruction, but that he would speak comfortably to her. That Hosea would look at his wife who was running with all these other guys, and he would take these things away to get her attention, say, look, I love you, I bought you for myself. Come home and be for me and I'll be for you. And God would look at Israel and say, you're running from me, but I'm going to take these things away so I can get your attention and pull you to myself and let me speak comfortably to you. In your trouble, in the trouble that I'm bringing upon you, not because I hate you, but because I love you and I want you to come to myself. And he does the same for us when we're dead in our trespasses and sins. Amen. He takes away any peace and joy that we might have because there's no peace or joy without Christ. And he draws us to himself and from his heart. He showed us, he demonstrated his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And he says that he would give them their vineyards and he would give them the valley of Achor for a door of hope. In verse 16, we'll come back there. In verse 16 he says, and it shall be in that day, saith the Lord, thou shalt call me Ishi, and shalt no more call me Bali. Ishi means my husband. Bali means my master. And so we look at this and God is saying, as we've read this, he looks more like a master than a husband. Because he's in charge, he's getting these things, he's disciplining. But it's with the purpose that it wouldn't be my master, but it's my husband. And this is the heart of Hosea. It's the heart of the book. It's the heart of the man. It's the heart of God that he represents. Is that it would be a loving relationship, one of faithfulness, of righteousness, of judgment, of mercy, of loving kindness. And that it would be a union as a husband and wife, not a master and servant, but as a husband and wife. And that's the goal, and that's why he's doing these things, is for this day. And that it would be, they would look and they would say, not Bali, not my master, but Ishi, my husband. So in verse 17, for I will take away the names of Balaam out of her mouth, and they shall be no more remembered by their names. And in that day will I make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field. Remember in verse 12, it says that the beasts of the field would devour her vine and her fig tree. And he says here, when that day comes, when you return to me and when I'm Ishi and not Bali, when I remove the name of Balaam out of your mouth, then I'll make a covenant with the beasts of the field and they won't devour. It also says that he'll make a covenant with the sword in the battle and will make them lie down in safety. And this was the nation that every time they turned from God, God would raise up an enemy army to overtake them. This is the same nation who was taken by Assyria in battle. And Judah was taken by Babylon in battle. And God says there's going to come a day when I'm going to take away, I'm going to break the bow and the sword. These things that are troubling you so much, they're necessary for right now because you need to come to me. You need to come to know me. He says, but in that day I'll break them and I'll let you lay down in safety. And we think about Gomer and we think about the dangerous situations that she would have been in because the lifestyle she had chosen and the people she would have been running with. And it says that earlier in the chapter, verses 6 and 7 there, that God would hedge about her way and lay thorns in her way, and she would be chasing her lovers all over the place and not find them. And we saw that he would take away her Sabbath. But the day is coming when that rest and that safety would be restored. And it's no longer Gomer all through the night being abused and being all those things, but it would be Hosea would come in at night from a hard day at work, and his wife would be laying safely in bed where she belonged, in their home, in the comfort and safety of their home. Verse 19, and I will betroth thee unto me forever, yea, I will betroth thee to me in righteousness and in judgment and in loving kindness and in mercy. I will even betroth thee unto me in faithfulness, and thou shalt know the Lord. It's where it all led to. All this was that they would know the Lord. Gomer was knowing everybody except for her husband. And take that however you take it. Israel was knowing all these other gods except for their God. And when God looked at these people, a nation that he loved, that he had bought for himself and that he had called to himself, he looked at them and he was doing all these things with the desire that they would come to know him. And in verse 16 is where verse 15 is where we took our title, The Valley of Achor for a Door of Hope. I need to finish because I need to head to the nursing home. But the Valley of Achor for a Door of Hope, if you go to Joshua chapter 6 and 7, you'll find that as God allowed Israel to take Jericho, that God said not to take of the silver and the gold or anything that was in the city. It was all to be burned because it was accursed. And it was for the Lord. But there was a man, Achan, who took some silver and some gold and a Babylonish garment, and he hid it in the floor under his tent. And the next battle was the Battle of Ai, and it was a small city, and Israel sent up a group to fight, and they got massacred by Ai. And so Joshua fell on his face before God, and he said, "Why have you done this? Why have you allowed us to be defeated in our enemies?" God says, "Why are you lying on your face? There's sin in the camp. You need to take care of it." And so they go through this whole thing. We don't have time to get into it, but Joshua 6 and 7, you can read it. And they come and they realize what Achan has done. And Achan confesses his sin that he had taken the gold and the silver and the Babylonish garment from Jericho. And because of that, they were unable to win the victory. Because of that, they would always experience defeat because of the sin in the camp. And it says there that Joshua and all of Israel took Achan and his family and all their possessions into the valley of Achor, into the valley of trouble. And they stoned them there with stones, and they burned them with fire. And they piled a heap of stones on it. It says that it remained to the day. And that was the valley of Achor. That's where we find the valley of Achor in Israel's history. It was a time when there was sin in the camp, and so all Israel could experience was defeat. What was Israel's hope then? What was Israel's hope for victory? That the sin would be paid for, that the sin would be taken away. That was their only hope. As long as that sin was in the camp, they would lose every battle they fought. And so the valley of Achor was their door of hope. The one hope they had was that the offender would die, that sin would be paid for and blotted out. The valley of Achor for a door of hope for us. We've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death. Without the shedding of blood is no remission. And he became sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. And it was what Christ did on the cross when he came to earth with a meek and lowly heart, and he humbled himself to those of us who were his enemies, who had run from him and had forsaken him. It was to us that Jesus came, and he demonstrated his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Amen. And his trouble, his tribulation, his suffering was the doorway to our hope. His valley of Achor, his Mount Calvary, it was our door of hope. And we stand today with hope, and it's Christ in us, the hope of glory. And it was the work that he did on the cross, taking our sins upon his back, nailing them to his cross, and bleeding and dying, presenting his precious blood to the Father, that we might have life eternally and life abundantly here on earth. And so as God writes to Israel, as Hosea writes of Gomer, as Jesus Christ would write of us, maybe we should be bold tonight. What are things in our life that God needs to take away to get us to be faithful to him? What are things in our life that God needs to take away from us, remove from us, do to us for us to return to him? Don't look at trouble as a bad thing because your valley of Achor might be the door of hope. I think it would do us all good to seek the Lord's face. Will it be pleasant for our corn to be taken away in the season thereof, and our wine in the season thereof? Was it a comfortable thing for Hosea to have Gomer to have her lewdness displayed to her lovers? It wasn't. But it was merciful, because the nation that forgets God will be turned into hell. And what should have happened was far worse. And this was merciful because she had another chance to come home. And all of us every day, we have a chance to come home to the Father. And let's take that chance. Let our valley of Achor be a door of hope. let the Lord trouble us. Because in Hosea 6, we'll find that if he tears, he will bind us up. If he is torn and smitten, he will bind together again. Let the Lord do that for us. Let's seek the Lord. And it's with the purpose in verse 20 that we would know the Lord. That's why these things are done. Pastor.